And next, we're going to have our ocean law panel, starting with Myron Nordquist, and then we're going to have John Briscoe, and then I think we'll have them both up here to answer your questions.
I'm not Myron Nordquist. That distinguished gentleman is Myron Nordquist. I'm John Briscoe. I'm a lawyer with offices actually just up the street, and I have a ridiculous title with the Law of the Sea Institute at the University of California across the way. A few moments ago, Pat Takahashi from the University of Hawaii leaned over to Myron and me and said, "Do you guys realize you have 90 minutes to cover?" And so I simply want to say I'm terribly delighted, and you will be too, that the last panel ran 10 minutes. It was very, very interesting, sir, that it went 10 minutes over because you have 10 fewer minutes to listen to us. But it also reminded me, Myron last night at dinner, Myron has had a distinguished career in the United States State Department in private practice in Washington, D.C., where he did much law of the sea work for many, many years, and as general counsel of the Air Force. And we're old friends and colleagues. And last evening at dinner, remember you mentioned Mike Ely. Northcote Ely was a very prominent Washington attorney. About 1975 or 6, I was in the law library. Now I realize most of you don't know what a library is. They have these things called books. And I was doing some research in a book of decisions of the United States Supreme Court. And the way you worked with books is you didn't search and go right to what you were looking for. You kept turning the page until you found, and so there was the serendipity factor, I called it. You ran across all kinds of stuff you weren't looking for, but that was rather interesting. And I ran across a minute order of the Supreme Court in a case called Arizona versus California, the biggest water rights case in the history of the world, and not just the United States. And it was 1962, and the Supreme Court, which many of you probably know, when it holds oral argument, it is typically 60 minutes, 30 minutes per side. Maybe in a very, very important case, the healthcare case a few months ago was absolutely extraordinary when it went several days for about 10 hours. I read this order, and it says the cause is set down for oral argument. California shall have 28 hours, Arizona shall have 12, and these other parties shall have this and that and the other. 28 hours. Now, Mike Ely was the lawyer for the state of California in that case. About a week later, he called me on something I can't remember now, but I said, wait, while I got you on the phone, I ran across this order. It must have been a typo. It couldn't have been set down for 28 hours. Oh, yes, it was, he said. And I said, how the heck did you come up with 28 hours of stuff to talk about in that case? And he said, I had absolutely no problem coming up with 28 hours of stuff to talk about. But I was worried about my legs, and so I climbed the 7 flights of stairs to my office and down every day for 3 months to get into shape. Now, thank heavens you don't have 28 hours to listen to us. It's an enormous subject to cover, the legal regime that reflects, that applies to the Seasteading Conference concept. But I want to... Myron was looking at this on his iPad. Yes, iPad, thank you. I cut it out. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal. Did anybody see the letter, the open letter to the Journal from Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Baker III, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice, all of the living secretaries of state who worked for Republican administrations, urging ratification at long last after 30 years of the Law of the Sea Treaty. It's a very, very interesting letter. You will also see that every Secretary of State who has worked for a Democratic president still living also supports the Law of the Sea Convention. It's very timely. This may be voted on. Myron's colleague, John Norton Moore at the University of Virginia, predicts that the United States will at last. The United States, which, with Myron's help, he was a member of the American delegation, forged all of the compromises that went into this treaty. Have you ever seen it? This is a book. It's going to go to the Smithsonian Institution soon, but this is a book. These things are called pages, and it's made of wood pulp formed in the paper. This is the Law of the Sea Convention, which was done in 1982. We hammered the compromises together that went into this Constitution for the Oceans, and we, the last major developed country in the world, not to have ratified it 30 years later, still haven't, but we may. And if we do, I suggest it has enormous ramifications for the seasteading movement and the seasteading concept, which I'll get back to in a moment. Now, Henry Kaiser, not Kissinger, who was from just across the bay, one of the greatest industrialists in the history of the world. The mention was made of Bill Gates, and I would say that Bill Gates can't hold a candle to the accomplishments in the historical context that Henry Kaiser achieved. But Kaiser famously said, find a need and fill it. And I think that Blue Seed and the Seasteading Institute and the entire movement has identified more than one need, just to pick one, America's fractured and flawed immigration laws, just to pick one, and has had the Malcolm Gladwell blank moment, seasteading, right? Well, you know, another great mind in American history was Thomas Edison, who said genius is 1% inspiration and blink, call it, and 99% perspiration. So I think we're at the 99% point. The concept is there. Now make it happen. Be a lot simpler. Myron and I are here to just give you a big macro look at the legal issues. I would suggest it would have been a lot simpler 350 years ago. Right? Why? Now, mind you, this doesn't even include the regulations and all that, but this is the laws regarding the oceans, which the official United States position for 30 years has been, all of this applies to us except for this stuff here. Isn't that convenient? All of this applies to us, and it's dense. You see the size of the font? It just goes on and on and on. 350 years ago, there was only one question. Are the seas open to all or closed to all? Simple as that. 1588, a pirate, we were talking about pirates, that great knighted pirate of Great Britain, Francis Drake, he was nothing but a pirate. Remember that. And he became knighted, and he's just a magnificent hero in the United Kingdom today. That led the English Navy against the Spanish Armada, and all of a sudden, little old England, led by a pirate, one of these Somali guys, could be the next Sir Francis Drake. All of a sudden, England is a naval power, right? And so what does it do? It hires a lawyer to write a legal opinion. John Selden wrote a legal opinion for the Crown that said, the seas are closed to all but Her Majesty's Navy. Right? And it's big and thick, and it's in Latin, and it's flowery language and all of that. Well, there was an up-and-coming naval power that was in the Indonesian area, and what we now call Indonesia and so forth. And not to be outdone, it hired a lawyer, Hugo de Groot. Okay? But we all know him as Grotius because he wrote in Latin. So he rendered his Dutch name, and he wrote Mare Liberum. So Selden had written Mare Clausum, the closed sea, and de Groot, Grotius, wrote Mare Liberum, the free sea. And for long involved, involuted historical reasons, the views of de Groot held, and the notion that the seas were open to all emerged and persisted for hundreds of years, with the little exception of the concept of the Territorial Sea and the cannon shot rule. So it was nice and simple back then. Seasteading would have been a heck of a lot simpler then. The need didn't exist then. Why cannot we have the simplicity when the need exists? I don't know. That's for historians to figure out. And so how do we get from, one question only, is it open or is it closed, to this? Well, the rise of naval power, the ability of cannons to fire beyond 3 nautical miles, and many, many things far beyond the scope of this presentation. But it happened. Now, before I get to how it happened and where we are today, we know about Clubstead, the Club Med on the sea. It was to, as I read, have a staff of about 70 and hold 200 guests. And it was going to be anchored, it was going to be using drilling platform technology and anchored 100 nautical miles off the coast of California. Was it 200? Okay. Well, that answers my question, because the Economist article last year said 100, so it was wrong? Okay. But when I heard that, I was reminded of, remember Bob Newhart's, one of his original skits, where he imagines Abner Doubleday, the inventor of baseball, having to have, living in today's era and needing a marketing firm to get this thing off the ground. So he phones the marketing guys. "Oh, Mr. Doubleday, what do you have?" You remember the skit? And it's, "You got a game. Well, how many couples? 18 people? It's a lot of couples, Mr. Doubleday." "Well, explain to me this game. You got a pitcher, and a catcher, and they throw this ball back and forth. And is that all there is to it?" "Oh, I see. A man stands between them, holding a bat." "What's a bat, Mr. Doubleday?" "I see. 3 strikes, you're out, and 4 balls." "And why 4 balls, Mr. Doubleday?" And wherever you decide to park the vessel, you want to think very, very clearly, why there? We have an old friend, John Craven, at the University of Hawaii, a colleague of John's not well, I gather. And John was a boy wonder in many respects, and he still is a genius. In the early 1950s, seasteading is not a new concept, as most of you know, but I found this fascinating in reading, rereading John's book recently. In the early 1950s, the United States launched the Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine. And they brought in this young scientist, John Craven, later got a law degree, taught law at the University of Hawaii, and said, "You heard about this nuclear-powered submarine?" "Yes." The Navy brass said, "What we want you to do is take that," and by the way, have you heard about an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, capable of going 5,000 miles and hitting a target with pinpoint accuracy? "Oh, yes." "Here's what we want you to do, Mr. Craven. We want you to take that nuclear submarine and outfit it with 18 ICBMs that can be launched from a depth of 3,000 feet and hit Moscow and Leningrad and so forth." And he did. He was the chief scientist on the Polaris missile project. So a few years later, in 1970, he ends up in Hawaii, and he writes in his book, which is called The Silent War, I believe. He said, "I soon took my first major initiative. In early September of 1970, in a speech to the American Institute of Architects, I stole a page from Martin Luther King and said, 'I have a dream. My dream,' I told the group, 'was of a floating city that moves serenely.'" This is known to everybody in the room. I just found this fascinating. Okay, this is 1970, 42 years ago. Another genius in American history, John Craven. "My dream was of a floating city that moved serenely 3 miles off the shores of Waikiki. I challenged the architects present to begin design studies of floating cities to meet the needs of our planet's burgeoning population," another need that you've identified, "which had but just passed the 3 billion mark, half of the 6 billion it reached in the fall of 1999. It was a dream rooted in the reality of a just completed study by the Navy," I'm going to come back to that, "on mobile oceanic floating bases. Craven had been a member of the three-man concept development team leading up to that report. Governor Burns of Hawaii had an even grander vision. He called me in and told me to proceed at flank speed. When I asked why, he answered, archipelago. Got to establish the archipelago. The idea the governor had was Hawaii had long claimed sovereignty over the channels between the 8 main islands. The 8 main islands, and all of them have water distances greater than 6, meaning in these days of a 3-mile territorial sea, you had international waters in between. The state of Hawaii had long maintained, no, going back to an 1842 legislation by the Parliament of Hawaii. Hawaii was a kingdom for 100 years. A floating city, quoting again from Craven, under Hawaii's jurisdiction more than 3 miles offshore would, in international law, be a demonstration of Hawaiian sovereignty over inter-island waters. The governor was right. The Hawaii Floating City project was underway. Renowned Japanese architect Kianori Kikutaki signed on. I, Craven, was the project director and engineer. Many departments of the University of Hawaii joined in, but the new worldwide interest in the law of the sea made it likely that Hawaii's archipelagic aspirations would be ignored or denied in the battle between the superpowers for control of the sea. He later writes of this. In the meantime, Hawaii, if you're interested, I'm reading from pages 255 to 261 of Craven's book. In the meantime, Hawaii's floating city project was progressing. With the help of the Navy and the Air Force, Hawaii built an 85-ton model and tested it in Kaneohe Bay. I wondered whether this Defense Department help was to provide a cover for continuing clandestine activity in mobile ocean basing, but I had no need to know, and so on and so forth. Point is, there was a tremendous amount of work done on the seasteading concept, if you will, with the support of the United States Navy and the Air Force 40-some-odd years ago, and it ought to be mined, to use a metaphor that I think is apt. It got waylaid, the Floating City in Hawaii project got waylaid by the Law of the Sea conference that began in 1974. And Myron, who was only 75 years old at the time, was, as I say, a member of the American delegation, and he's got stories that he can tell you about that. But how did we get from that very simple, is the ocean open, are the seas open, or are they closed, to this? Well, it was a series of steps. In 1930, the old League of Nations held a conference for the codification of international law at The Hague, produced a lot of fine stuff, including a draft treaty that would regulate all of the law of the sea, but it didn't get ratified. World War II came. Following the war, the United Nations, which was created right here in San Francisco in 1945, set to work on a global treaty on the law of the sea. The preparatory work was done by something called the International Law Commission, but in 1958 at Geneva, 4 treaties were done. It was originally going to be one big treaty, but 4 treaties: the Territorial Sea, the Continental Shelf, the high seas, and what's the fish. But there was a problem. One of the fundamental questions in the law of the sea, the right of a coastal state meaning nation, to have territory, marine territory off of its coast, sovereign marine territory, in other words, as much the United States as this ground we're standing on, was recognized, but there was no agreement as to the breadth of the territorial sea. And the big question was 3 miles or 12. There were a lot of other positions being taken, but that was the fundamental cleavage. That was not decided in 1958. In 1960, a single purpose Conference on the Law of the Sea was again convened at Geneva. This was the second UN conference, and its sole purpose was, let's decide the breadth of the territorial sea. A 6-mile territorial sea with a 6-mile contiguous zone compromise proposed by the Soviets and the United States failed by 1 vote, and the story why that failed is absolutely hysterical, but ought to be told over a martini with censors, being very careful of the politically correct police are not around. So we go into the 1960s with this question, what's the breadth of the territorial sea? We, the United States, had claimed the continental shelf in 1945, breaking with the rest of the world. In response, nations on the southern coast of South America, for example, that don't have a geological continental shelf, began claiming very, very wide territorial seas to respond. And then a funny thing happened in 1960. A scientist over at the University of California published a book. John Merrill published a book, and he said, gee, the 1876 voyage of the Challenger, a British exploration vessel, found these rocks on the bottom of the ocean floor. And they thought nothing of them at the time, but Merrill said, guess what? They're rich in copper and nickel and cobalt. We don't have a single cobalt mine in the United States. Is that well known? We don't have a nickel mine anymore. I don't think we have a single nickel mine nor cobalt mine. We're absolutely essential for our national security. At the time, we got all of our cobalt, which you need for every high-quality steel alloy, jet aircraft engines, drill bits, you name it. Where did we get our cobalt? Zambia and Zaire. So this book caused quite a stir. In 1967, the Maltese ambassador to the UN made this stentorian speech on the floor of the General Assembly that these manganese nodules sitting, at 16, 18, 20, 25,000 feet of depth on the ocean floor containing this cobalt, and this copper, and this nickel shouldn't be America's just for plucking off the ocean floor. They are and ought to be, and this phrase has just rung through international law ever since, the common heritage of mankind. Oh, and a great movement, Elizabeth Mann Borghese and others went forward, and the United States said, oh, we're very interested in it, and and they pulled off one of the greatest ruses of all time, which maybe I'll let you tell.
You're on a roll.
No, but you were there. You were part of this great feint. And so the combination, this is an oversimplification, but the combination of the lack of agreement as to the breadth of the territorial sea, right? 3, 12, something else, and this lust for the great riches on this seabed. Should they be for the Japanese and the Americans to just pluck off there and get ever richer? Or should they belong to the G77, the group of 77, the developing countries of the world? Well, we've got to address this. So we had a third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, very much focused on the riches of the deep seabed. And we're not going to just spend a couple of months at this. While we're at it, because we're going to meet in places like Geneva and New York and Montego Bay, nice places, let's do this for 8 years. And they did. They did it for 8 years, and they produced this. And I'm gonna let you tell the punchline of the great feint, Myron. So what does this treaty establish? By the way, remember, the United States isn't signatory to this treaty. We have not ratified it. We may in the next several months, but we haven't. But we do say very obliquely that most of this is international law anyway, and we're bound by it. But there are certain parts we don't like, and we're not going to pay any attention to those. We're not going to abide by that. It establishes a territorial sea of up to 12 miles, and virtually every maritime nation has now claimed a territorial sea up to 12 miles. For all intents and purposes, the territorial sea is as much the territory of the country as the terra firma we're standing on. Well, terra firma, this was Bay Phil. If we have the big one, we're going to be in a bunch of mud right here, I'll tell you. The original base shoreline was a few blocks away. A contiguous zone. What is a contiguous zone? Because we've heard a lot of talk about 12.1 nautical miles, great place to position a seastead. Contiguous zone is not part of the territory of the coastal state, but the coastal state does have certain jurisdiction over it. What jurisdiction? To enforce its fiscal, sanitary, revenue, and immigration laws. Okay? 12 to 24 miles, you have this contiguous zone. Remember back when it was really simple, you just open or close, that was all there was to it. Okay, next, that's in Article 33. Next, it establishes in Article 55 and the following articles an exclusive economic zone, which goes out to 200 miles. And the exclusive economic zone has vests a lot of power in the coastal state. It doesn't start at 24, it starts at 12. So you have that overlap. Between 12 and 24, you have not only the contiguous zone, but you've got the exclusive economic zone. Now we're going back to the continental shelf jurisdiction in Articles 76 and 77, and the several articles that follow. What's a continental shelf? Well, it is the natural prolongation of the land territory out to the edge of the continental margin. Okay, takes about 1,500 words to define continental margin. It's not fun. Yeah, I dare anybody to read it and tell me what it means. I think it was designed for us lawyers, actually. And the continental shelf also begins at the Territorial Sea, not at the edge of the contiguous zone. So now from 12 to 24, maybe you've got continental shelf jurisdiction as well as exclusive economic zone jurisdiction as well as contiguous zone, and each of these three vests certain powers in the coastal state. Now beyond the EEZ, you have two things. You have high seas, okay? But remember, this is just the water. The stuff below, beyond the continental shelf, I should say, because the continental shelf extends to a minimum distance of 200 miles, you have something called the area. Which is the seabed and the ocean floor and the subsoil beyond national jurisdiction. Article 137, no state shall claim sovereignty over any part of the area. It says nothing about a person or a corporation. It's bizarrely silent on that because this conference had not been held yet. That's why. If it had, they would have addressed it. Now, you've heard quite enough from me. Let me, mind you again, the United States has not ratified, and the statement of the United States, the still official position of the United States, is contained in the Oceans Policy Statement of President Ronald Reagan, given on March 10, 1983. That was the same date on which he issued the EEZ proclamation, saying, well, even though we're not going to ratify this thing, we're going to claim an EEZ. Why? You know the old joke, because we can. Who the hell's going to tell us we can't, see? But in the Oceans Policy Statement, which accompanied the EEZ proclamation, President Reagan stated that in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, the area, which is clearly under the authority of the Seabed Authority under the convention, heavily regulated. It's like having the Bureau of Land Management's Mineral Management Service cubed, on steroids, whatever metaphor you like, regulating that stuff. But the United States official position as of today is that in that area, quote, deep seabed mining is a lawful exercise of the freedom of high seas and open to all. Vastly different from the legal regime contained in the treaty. I think that has, if we don't think about 12.1 nautical miles, we're thinking about a little farther offshore. The current American position is far more favorable to the seasteading concept than the treaty would be. I'm not going to, we thought we might touch upon local land use regulation because there's going to be there would be an enormous need for shoreside support, say here in San Francisco Bay. The Port of Redwood City, with which I'm very familiar, is a very likely example because of, I mean, Oracle is, you can, toss a small rock and hit one of those buildings from the Port of Redwood City. But there's a whole regulatory regime there that we're not going to even touch upon. But I'll just leave you with these thoughts, let Myron speak. He's got some great stories to tell. I think that a suggestion would be, from a legal analysis, is for every concept to do a constraints analysis for 12.1 nautical miles, 24.1, 200.1, floating and moving, moored, anchored, to do a constraints analysis. If a vessel of this sort, if a facility, I'll use a more generic term, of this sort, were to be here, what are the legal constraints? If it were to be here, what are the legal constraints? If it were to be here, what if it were of a different design and the anchors were lifted periodically and so forth? Do a matrix or whatever you're comfortable with and then take a good hard look at the issues. The United States said that with the exception of Part 11, the deep seabed mining provisions of the 82 treaty, it was all, quote, customary international law. What does that mean? I'll define it in the negative. International law, public international law, consists of two things: treaties, which are called conventional international law, and customary, which is everything else. What are the sources of customary international law? Two things. The practices, the actual practices of nations. What do they do? Is it getting accepted? Okay? De Grotius's views got accepted. Selden's did not. Grotius's views became mare liberum, customary international law. That's gross oversimplification, but that's kind of it. Look for other nations of the world to recognize seasteading. Okay? Encourage other nations of the world by issuing legal opinions from their legal advisor's office. Another source of customary international law, I'm suggesting that you want to develop it. Another source of it is, quaint terminology, the writings of publicists. A publicist doesn't mean those guys on Madison Avenue who write advertisements on the radio. It means legal writers, scholars like Myron, who publish in the law reviews. There is a reason that you see so much writing in international law, just as John Selden and Hugo de Groot wrote for clients. Big myth in the law schools that they wrote because they believed in these things. But nonsense. Client hired them and said, I want a legal opinion that establishes this. All right? No, government lawyers are doing this all the time. And you know when they do it because there's always a footnote. Myron Nordquist, writing while he was in the State Department, footnote, the views expressed herein are those of the writer only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the United States government. That's when you know they really do reflect the views of the United States government, and they're trying to get them floated out there. So I would encourage that. And finally, I think that there is a treasure trove of engineering, architecture, and legal scholarship based on the Hawaii city, floating city concept. And remember, the Defense Department, the Army, and the Navy were behind that, and I think that ought to be mine. So those are my suggestions. Now you're going to hear somebody who really knows what he's talking about.